Construction of the new St. Peter's became a very costly endeavor. Expensive construction costs with the resulting controversial methods of distorting Christian beliefs to create the badly needed building funds ultimately brought on the Protestant Reformation, as well as the subsequent 100 years religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the new Catholic mysticism brought on by the Counterreformation of the Council of Trent. That was 1545 to 63, and the Church's effort to contain the damage brought about by the Protestant Reformation. The use of Trompe-l'œil afforded the Catholic Church the opportunity to reestablish a mystical, wondrous experience of Christianity as opposed to the clear light, oftentimes severe, seemingly rational views of Protestantism.
Thanks everyone for coming. This is the title, Is It Excess or New Mysticism? And this deals with the Counter-Reformation response to the Reformation. I always kind of poo-pooed this period of church architecture because to me it just seemed like it was too much excess more than anything. Look at this, and I don't think I'd feel comfortable worshiping God in this environment. It's just like too opulent and kind of shiny. But that was part of the using the building as propaganda and advertising, so forth, that we're better than the other guys. You got a lot of this going on. And so I never really took it that seriously. It just wasn't a personal interest. But then I started getting into it a little bit more. You can see this exuberance and these pieces that are kind of out in free space and that goes over cornices and things hanging down and bursting upwards and so forth. And this started to get me thinking about what was happening. In 1545 to 63, the Council of Trent happened, and that's where the Catholic Church makes reformations in response to the Protestant Reformation. And also in 1648, that is the end of very, very bloody 30 years religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics that swept across Europe. For one thing, the Huguenots or Huguenots from France ended up immigrating here and settling, and a lot of them came in through Charleston, South Carolina. You see these very complex looking warped spaces, but if you look under all the confection, you'll see that there's still a nave, there's still side aisles, there's still a triforium, there's a clear story, and a vault overhead. We're still using the same form of architecture that goes back to the Constantine Basilica, even though it's now heavily cloaked in what I used to refer to as excess. And if you remember when I was last week, when I was talking about St. Peter's, and we're looking at the ribbed dome, in each one of those ribs, there was 3 different panels, and inside each panel was a figure, a saint or prophet or something like that, and some sort of associated symbolism or images, but they were all neatly framed. And you'll notice here that nothing is really neatly framed anymore. It's kind of like cicadas attaching themselves all over the place. It's just everywhere. And it's really hard to focus anymore on something. I started thinking about that, and I was wondering if this is a time where they've been through decades now of reasoning rationalism, and if they're not somehow trying to express a new sort of mysticism or a look into something other than the rational. Okay, so we have the altar, the apse, and etc. at the back, and we have vaulted naves, the dome of heaven, round arches, a drum, pendentives, ribbed arches, an oculus. So it's still part of the same vocabulary of neoclassical and even Gothic in a way, but it almost looks like a wedding cake where you squeeze that icing around on a Gothic framework or a basilica framework. This is another example of that stuff where things hang over cornices and moldings. You can see stuff dripping over these cornices. And then I came across this painting, and it reminded me of something that I had forgotten about. It ended up being a major feature of what I'm going to talk about in the first part here. And this is painting that reminded me of my childhood. It's called Escaping Criticism, and it's kind of stepping out. I think you've all had this experience at one time or another, where you've stepped out of one world and you're going into another. But what's interesting about this is a painting of a boy leaving a picture frame. And so the frame is part of the painting. And this is called trompe-l'œil. It's a French word, a French phrase meaning to fool the eye. And so you can see the artist has cast the shadow of the boy, his head on the picture frame, the shadow of his fingers. He's overlapping the picture frame, just like in the architecture we were looking at previous to this, where stuff overlaps other things. And so where, what he's leaving perhaps one reality for another. He's blurring the boundary of the real and the imagination. He's leaving one reality for another. And I quickly want to give you a recent example of trompe-l'œil. This is the pyramid at the Louvre in Paris. And this is a pretty amazing thing what they did. They took the pyramid and they started to make it disappear. And what they did is they put these panels of photographs of the Louvre behind the pyramid, and then the pyramid goes away. It looks like this black and white triangle on top of the Louvre. And to say the least, that is definitely trompe-l'œil, fooling the eye. And so if we take that back into the church in the Counterreformation in St. Ignacio, Rome, we have this incredible trompe-l'œil of ascension into heaven. It's just like, here's these Romanesque arches with stuff in front of them, people looking down, people sitting on things with their legs hanging over, angels flying about, cherubim, clouds and skies. You just look at this and it reminds me of what you look at in a Gothic church with the stained glass. It's too much. It becomes overwhelming and incredible. This, of course, is a trompe-l'œil. And if you remember that vault I showed you before with the dome and the oculus, and this whole thing is a trompe-l'œil. So what happens is the oval starts to come into play. This is at Karl's church in Vienna, Karlskirche, in a Baroque church. And the oval becomes a central element of Baroque and Rococo architecture. And the inside of that looks something like this. And you'll notice that it's multi-layered. You have these cornices going up, and there's the oculus with the dove of the Holy Spirit, all this stuff going on, layers and layers and layers going up. But it's still that basic, what's now become an alternative to Gothic architecture, where we have a dome, where we have a drum and an oculus. And this time the dome is a Baroque oval, and the dove of the Holy Spirit at the top of the underside of the lantern. And this too is a trompe-l'œil. So this whole the fool the eye, has become a way of expressing, I think, a new way of looking at God in a mystical way without violating the tenets of reason and rationalism. So what is of this world and what is not? That really starts to beg the question. And I think that this is an excellent response to that question, in that it leaves a delicious ambiguity about what's going on in faith as well as in the material world. This is the main facade of the Church of the Gesù in Rome. It's the first Jesuit church built in Rome. And you can see it's pretty simple. The temple facades stacked one on the other and stepped out and so forth, like we saw at St. Peter's, but it's much flatter. It's very simple. And it's a superimposition of multiple temple fronts, as I said. And if you notice, there's arch pediment over this sculptural niche here. And there's a triangular pediment as ornament over that niche of upper level. And the significance of that is this stuff makes its way across the ocean. And you can see in the White House, we have alternating triangle arch pediments as ornaments on the facade of the White House. And then one of the signatures of these Baroque churches, particularly in Italy, are the use of these brackets. They're almost like bookends that they use to hold this temple back together to keep it from falling apart. I don't think it's a structural necessity, but it becomes a signature of these particularly Italian Baroque churches. But what's important is there's a real striking contrast between the outside and inside. So the outside is kind of this rational and simple, and it's easy to understand. But you go inside and, oh my goodness, you have this cascade of people and cherubim and seraphim and whatever else they are. You can see they overlap cornices, this opening. Is it a real opening? Is this a vault? And are these painted on it? Here are these clouds casting shadows and this big pile of people spilling out. It's just like totally overwhelming. And so we get this contrast between the outside, which is simple and rational, and the inside surfaces, which are complex and what I call gauzy. Back in the Gothic presentations, like their Gothic predecessors, the Rococo surfaces are dematerialized. Instead of using colored light, paint and sculpture are used to create another world of spirit. And that's my thesis. I don't know if anybody else agrees with that or not, but I'm putting it out there for your consideration. And then this is the close-up of some of that painting. So what is of this world and what is not of this world? And the whole mystical scene builds to a focus on the cross of heaven. If you look carefully, I hope you can see that. There is a cross with a burst of sun rays behind it. And then using techniques of Trompe-l'œil, you have these things hanging over and spilling out. This stuff's just spilling out. It's just incredible. I mean, you could sit there and look at this for hours. And I think that can take you to another place, which is, I think, really the purpose of architecture and art in music in our worship. And these are some more details of that same ceiling. Quite impressive. And my question is this a return to the Gothic mystical mind? And is this a rejection of Renaissance rational thinking, at least in the world of Christian thinking? And I think this is kind of a beautiful response to what was becoming the severe tenets of Protestantism. Like I said, I started out kind of poo-pooing this as just excessive. Then I started getting into it a little bit, and I think there's much, much more to it than just excess. I think it's a different type of mysticism in response to that hard-edged rational thinking that was popular. And so my question is to you, is this how the spirituality of Christianity survived the age of reason?
Secular humanism becomes popular and widespread in Western Europe following the writings of the great scientists and philosophers of the time, such as Newton, Voltaire, Descartes, and many others. The neoclassical church becomes expressive of rational as opposed to mystical thinking. The use of the Roman and Greek classical orders of columns on church facades becomes the expression of a modern thinking religion. Having said that, let's take a look at what the French and particularly Thomas Jefferson brought to the American shores.